We'll start it now. All right. So I'll just introduce you and me. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Public Forum Debate Academy. I'm here with Doug Bandow. Mr. Bandow is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He covers foreign policy and civil liberties, and he's previously worked as a special assistant with President Ronald Reagan and has been an editor of the political magazine Inquiry. My first question is about Turkey and NATO, actually. I first wanted to talk about Turkey's purchase of Russian military technology, particularly the S-400 air defense system. I was wondering why does Turkey's choice to purchase this technology hinder the US and NATO's relationships?
Well, the question is its interaction with aircraft that Turkey presumably would purchase from the United States. Turkey was going to be part of the F-35 program, not only purchasing airplanes, but also helping to produce it. And this is fairly significant technology from an American standpoint. We wouldn't want information getting to the Russians. And the question gets into, to the extent that they use simultaneously, S-400s and have them operating plus have F-35s, to what extent data might be kind of incorporated into the system and communicated to Moscow. That, I mean, in a sense, you have completely incompatible systems. That is, you have Russian air defense and US aircraft. From an American standpoint, if you're going to be an ally and you're going to be involved in not only purchasing, using them, but also producing them, that's viewed as simply inconsistent. That we want you to choose one side or the other. We don't want you choosing systems that in effect are incompatible and where information might be communicated to the other side.
I see. So it's primarily an issue of compatibility, that being Turkey already has US technology, and by purchasing this Russian technology, one, it could lead to information being translated, and two, it doesn't work with US technology in the first place.
Well, the idea is that if you're looking at newer advanced, I mean, presumably older aircraft, Russians know the parameters of, and have that. F-35 is supposed to be a new kind of air superiority, airplane. So we wouldn't want to have that kind of information communicated. And there's a broader sense of, what team are you on? That the U.S. has the CATSCA, kind of restrictions on, where the U.S. actually imposes sanctions on, in theory, on any country that buys Russian, equipment. And that is a broad prohibition that's primarily an attempt to weaken Russia, to reduce its sales. It really doesn't have an awful lot to do with U.S. security otherwise. So that comes into play automatically as well. So that's a kind of an embarrassment. You start sanctioning your ally from NATO because they're purchasing Russian equipment. But with the F-35, the S-400s, S-400s are quite advanced. So that is the fear, is you don't want to have information getting back to the Russians. It would actually improve that system that could be used elsewhere against US F-35s or other aircraft.
Yes, I see now. My second question is actually about the Middle East and Turkey's role in that. So Turkey has, in some ways, been in conflict with the United States with regards to terrorist groups like ISIS, for instance. In what ways, outside of that, or even about ISIS, is the US coming in conflict with Turkey's foreign policy? And how does that misalign, perhaps, with NATO's kind of core focus on remaining centralized and focus on their own foreign policy initiative?
Well, there are really two issues. I mean, under Erdogan especially, I mean, in certain things he represents as much as creates. I mean, he's not the only one who believes this. If you look at popular attitudes in Turkey, it's highly hostile to the US government. This has simply been a long time issue where governments traditionally were in favor, were pro, but unfortunately, the people themselves were not. And that kind of survived pre-Erdogan, where you had military kind of power behind other governments. I mean, if you look historically, they had a number of real coups as well as soft coups. Military played a very significant role. That has ended under Erdogan. So Erdogan has come up with a much more independent kind of neo-Ottoman, people talk about, foreign policy, where Turkey is trying to be an independent power in the Middle East, kind of looking both east and west. So this is one where Erdogan is trying to separate from the United States and NATO. And that not all of these positions are inherently antagonistic to the US and NATO, but it definitely, if you look, for example, its relationship with Russia, you have it, it's I mean, it's a complicated relationship. It's not purely a pro relationship. They almost went to war at the point where Turkey shot down a Russian airplane, and then they made up. And today they're kind of both against and with each other. You look in Syria, you look in Azerbaijan versus Armenia. The relationship is a complicated one. But Erdogan is striking out essentially on his own. So he's come into conflict with Saudi Arabia. The revelations over Jamal Khashoggi came from the Turks, who had bugged the consulate in Istanbul. Syria has been a U.S. ally. I mean, this is one where Turkey is taking a position somewhat adverse, to the United States, and ISIS was part of that. And this is kind of the second big area. So broadly, you can call this neo-Ottoman. Very specifically, the issue of the Kurds is one that has always been a problem with Turkey. Turkey has had a very difficult relationship. I mean, at one point, it even refused to call its people Kurds. On a visit of mine years ago, I was told there are no Kurds. They're simply mountain Turks. And Turkey went through a very vicious war. I mean, you go back to the PKK, Öcalan. 30 or more thousand people died in that. Thousands of villages were destroyed. Erdogan came in and made overtures to the Kurdish population, but then I think primarily for political reasons turned against it. So you go out into the southeast, there are a lot of cities that they have basically kicked out the mayors. He's gone after the party, which has largely Kurdish party, arguing that it's a terrorist party. A lot of this, very much it's politics, but it's nationalism. And you see that play over into Syria. So Erdogan is far more concerned about Syrian Kurds than he is about ISIS. So in the early days, Turkey was basically turned a blind eye to ISIS. It allowed people to go back and forth. There were rumors, unproved, but rumors that his own family was involved in selling stolen Syrian oil from ISIS. I visited that way. It's been several years, but there are an awful lot of Syrian refugees in the area. They were allowed, as far as we could tell, were allowed over. It wasn't a real problem. I went to a hospital that had a lot of Syrian, wounded Syrian insurgents, some of whom would have been ISIS fighters. Now they've tightened up a bit, more recently. Nevertheless, the focus continues to be on the Kurds. They've invaded a couple of times over the border. They've cleared out some of the border areas that were historically part of the Syrian Kurdish population. And these are the folks the U.S. worked with against ISIS. Right. So you're seeing Syria put its priorities first. Number one, a broad sense of Syrian nationalism, neo-Ottomanism, and secondly, very specifically focusing on Kurds to the detriment of a war against ISIS, and frankly, a willingness to tolerate ISIS activities so long as they did not directly attack Turkey.
I see. So it seems almost that Turkey has, and Erdogan has particularly a lot of actors that he has to almost play towards. NATO is just one of those roles, and that's why he's, I suppose, creating relationships not only with the United States, but also with actors such as Russia, if that clarifies.
Yeah, I think his view with NATO is that he's subordinate. NATO is a major alliance with the United States plus major European powers. Turkey is not noted for being a significant member of NATO. He wants Turkey to have a unique foreign policy. You see that in the Eastern Mediterranean as well, involvement in Libya, some of the naval activities, kind of conflicts with Greece and Cyprus, right, where these are issues where Erdogan has clearly ramped up the sense that Turkey has its own interests, and it's been quite willing to come into conflict with Germany and France, who are running naval operations to try to enforce an EU arms embargo in Libya. Quite clear that that Turkey was shipping arms to their preferred kind of clients there. They provided drones and other things that were they were very active in some of the fighting. So I think what it shows, his view is he doesn't want Turkey to be subordinate anymore. And part of NATO, you're kind of part of the Anglo, you're the transatlantic, you're subordinate to the transatlantic alliance, subordinate to the transatlantic powers. He wants to have, he sees Turkey as being a very significant regional power, a power at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. So he wants Turkey to be willing to go forward. And you look at Azerbaijan, Armenia, played a major role in arming Azerbaijan, that in the war a year ago, where Azerbaijan made major progress against Armenia. A lot of that was Turkey. So I think what you see here is this is an attempt to strike out on his own, where he doesn't want to give up NATO. And part of that, I think, is defensive. He understands it far better to have that link, but he clearly doesn't want that to limit his course of action.
I see. And that's actually quite interesting, because my third question was actually about that interaction between NATO and Turkey, particularly the interaction between Greece and Turkey. Because I know that there's been conflicts between these countries, not only between Greece, but also between countries like Germany, and I believe France as well. So I just want to discuss with you how of those like relationships essentially deteriorated over the past few years. What is Turkey and Greece, how are these conflicts happening? And I guess how does that play into NATO's strategic role?
Well, Greek and Turkish conflicts go back more than a century. I mean, Greece was once, occupied by the Ottoman Empire. The Greeks revolted. You go back to 1824, the very famous John Quincy Adams statement about we're the well-wisher of the independence of all. We don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. That was actually in the context of Greek independence activities, where some Americans wanted to support Greece against Turkey. This is 1824. This is almost 200 years ago. So this is a conflict that goes way back. Greece won its independence back in the late 1800s. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire fell apart. I mean, a Greek army ended up in Anatolia. I mean, that's where Ataturk kind of got his, made him the father of the Turkish nation. He beat that back. So the Republic of Turkey came out of the Ottoman Empire. So the conflict with the Greeks goes way back. I mean, there is shared territory they both want. That's the real problem.
Right.
These days, a lot of it is focused on the islands, that Greece controls islands very close to Turkish landmass. Now, under the law of the sea treaty, if you hold the islands, you get airspace, you get water, territorial waters. From a Turkish standpoint, that's unacceptable, because that gives Greece, kind of basically rights right up to, the Turkish coast. So you get overflights, you get a lot over that. And then there's the island of Cyprus in again, this is when it was a British colony. It's largely Greek. Back in the, I think in the late 60s, there had been a coup in Greece. Back in 74, the Greek colonels who were in charge basically made a play to take over the island of Cyprus, tear up an agreement that had been made, kind of allocating power in the communities. Turkey invaded, took 37% of the island, created what they call the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. It's recognized only by Turkey. And there have been talks essentially ever since about reunification. So this gets into, currently it's an issue of resources, where the Republic of Cyprus wants to develop resources. Turkey, acting in the name of the TRNC, basically claims resources for the Turkish, this Turkish Cypriot state. And there have been clashes over that. Cyprus is part of the European Union, and Greece as well. Basically, they've made pretty clear that Turkey will never be part of the EU until these are solved. So that all of that stuff. So the problem with the Greek-Turkey thing is this goes back historically, and it predates NATO. This is very deep on both sides. Turkey actually, Greece, as I remember, has the highest percentage of GDP devoted to the military of any NATO member, including the United States. That is primarily directed at Turkey, not Russia. So, in Turkey, in many ways, the same kind of thing, that they watch very carefully, what Greece is up to. And it's a real problem. It's a problem for the EU. But that's getting into the Eastern Mediterranean, the issue of Libya. That is part of this, where Turkey, in supporting the one of the two governments or purported governments in Libya, got them to sign an agreement turning over essentially water rights, territorial water rights to them. That's part of this larger game involving Greece and resources in Cyprus.
I see. So it's more of a long-standing issue.
Yes.
And in fact, Turkey's membership of NATO, or with NATO rather, and Greece's membership with NATO probably conflicts that issue even more so, because as an outsider standpoint, perhaps from the US's standpoint, when you're dealing with two different allies, and they're both members of NATO, it might be difficult to help resolve those issues.
No, that's right. Look, both of them came in during the Cold War, and it was anti-Soviet. That was a time when all that mattered from a US standpoint was to stabilize Europe.
Right.
That Greece was part of that. Greece had gone through a civil war. The US wanted to make sure that that did not revive in Greece. Turkey was in a critical point, especially controlling access to the Black Sea.
Right.
This was very useful in dealing with the Soviet Union. So, and in that kind of an environment, disputes between Greece and Turkey kind of subsided, where, overall you're much more concerned about the larger issue, but that, they blew up. I mean, the point is 1974, they almost went to war. I mean, one reason the Greek junta fell was the dictator at the time wanted to go to war with Turkey, and his colleagues said, "You're nuts," because Greece would have lost, any conflict. And that's where it kind of blew out. So this is a pre-existing conflict, and you're right, it makes it very hard to handle, because both of them have major lobbying operations in Washington. Both of them spend a lot of money. There are Greek Americans and Turkish Americans who are very active.
Mhm.
And, in Europe, I mean, they vary. I mean, Scandinavian countries are very hostile to Turkey. Germany has an awful lot of Turkish Germans. So Germany responds differently because of that kind of a connection. I mean, you've seen France come into conflict over the issue of Libya and transfer of arms. So, Europeans are divided on this, as well. And Turkey has used issues of immigration against the European Union and basically turn on or off, we're going to let Syrian refugees in or not. I mean, they currently have an agreement where they help pay. Turkey has millions of refugees. It's a real burden. So Turkey has basically said, you pay us if you don't want us to open up the tap. So that adds, another level of complexity to that relationship, because where they show up is Greece. I mean, the kind of most immediate border would be Greece.
I see. So lots of different parts. I found that the concept of deterrence probably works well, is particularly with the refugee crisis, probably that Turkey's using that to kind of play to their strengths.
No, that's right. I mean, the Europeans are very sensitive to that issue back in 2014, 2015. I mean, about 1 million, refugees, heavily Syrian, but Afghan and others, ended up in Germany. It helped create the alternative for Germany, a far right anti-immigration party. It had, impact across Europe. Countries like Hungary and others basically said, screw your EU rules. We're going to keep these people out. They don't want to repeat. I mean, it's political dynamite. So Turkey has found a way to use that. I mean, other countries don't like the fact they use it, but the reality is it's still a threat.
I see. All right. Final question. I wanted to talk about Turkey's kind of democracy and how that has honestly weakened over time. So we saw that in I think it was around the 1950s when Turkey was accepted into NATO. It was primarily for a strategic goal, but we did see democracy and its institutions beginning to form. However, it seems that during Erdogan's reign, it's almost as if the functions of democracy have slided. So I was just wondering, in what ways do you know of this democratic backsliding, and how does that, do you think, affect NATO?
Well, I realize that, I mean, Turkey was always an authoritarian democracy. I mean, until Erdogan came along, I mean, the military was the ultimate power.
I see.
Now, they had elections and governments formed. But there were at least two at least two hard coups, and there were several soft coups.
Mhm.
The worst was, I think, 1961, in which the military took power and ultimately executed the prime minister and some cabinet members. I mean, this was brutal. Now, this was not a massive shootout like some of the coups you find in other countries. And I have a friend, actually, he's in residence at the Cato, Mustafa Akil, who is a kind of a liberal Muslim, has written a lot on Islam, was a political columnist in Turkey, and is now outside of Turkey because he's been critical of Erdogan. But he talks about visiting his father in a prison camp after the 61 coup. So we shouldn't have any illusions about what that Turkey was. I mean, the military was always the ultimate power, and so it destroyed parties. It had basically had influence over the constitutional court. It would make threats. Erdogan ended up in jail. He was the Istanbul mayor and read a poem that had kind of Islamist. I mean, I think most Americans will look at it and say, what's the big deal? But for Turkey, this is very, very important, because the whole Turkish state, the Ataturk state, was a very secular one. I mean, it banned women from wearing headscarves, university or et cetera. And the military viewed its job as enforcing that very radical secularism. So when Erdogan came along, I mean, there was a real struggle. I mean, he wasn't even eligible prime minister originally. His party won the parliamentary election, And I think, he ended up, what was it, the fellow who ended up as ultimately as president, and now I think he's out of the party, but a colleague of his ended up as prime minister to start, because they had to organize the government, pass a law to eliminate the disability of having been in prison before Erdogan could legally become prime minister. And Erdogan was very effective. He moved very effectively over the years. He won 6 or 7 elections. I mean, he really established his popular legitimacy, and then he moved against the military. And even then, I mean, while there are a lot of people kind of more liberal academic, I mean, I was one who were very pleased with what we saw Erdogan doing, because they were working with liberals. I mean, I talked with feminist activists in Turkey who said that Erdogan, the AKP, were better on issues like violence against women than the old nationalists.
Mhm.
But there was a point, 2010, 11, 12, somewhere in there, where the AKP had established its authority, and it turned in a much more authoritarian and corrupt direction. It took over media, it used tax, kind of authorities and other pressure on businessmen, forced sales.
Locking people up, and
Yeah, exactly.
particularly journalists.
That's right. Starting to apply the laws very ruthlessly, going after critics of Erdogan. So you had a lot of this going on, and then going after the Kurds, for example, using that politically, going after political opponents.
Mhm.
And then the 2016 attempted coup really was his opportunity, where it became. And I think it was an attempted coup. I mean, some people think he put it on. I doubt that, but that is one of the arguments that was made, because it worked out so beautifully for him.
I see.
But I mean, after tens of thousands of people have been put in jail, tens of thousands fired from their jobs. You find a number of over here in America. There are people I worked with who organized conferences, which took me to Turkey, who no longer can travel to Turkey because they would be put in jail.
Mhm.
So what today? The only freedom, political freedom, is they actually have a vote. And the real interesting question is, will he allow a free vote next time? Because a couple of years ago, when they lost the Istanbul mayoral race, he forced a rerun. That was a disaster for him, because the margin of the win margin for the opposition party jumped like tenfold.
Mhm.
But if he's learned from that, a lot of people wonder if he'll actually allow a free election next time. So it has moved very I mean, I forget the man's name. It's somebody who Erdogan really hates and is locked up, and like 2 or 3 times he's been acquitted in courts. Erdogan just locks him up again. So we've moved beyond a genuine democracy. It still has elections, but it's up there with China in the number of journalists who are in jail. I mean, tens of thousands of people have been jailed. So you wouldn't call it really a democracy now. And it is a problem for NATO. In theory, NATO's bound together by values. I mean, new members coming in have to achieve a certain level. That's why Ukraine, Georgia, I mean, set aside the whole Russia issue, they aren't eligible under NATO standards to join, because they have not had the political reforms necessary. Never
Mhm.
mind Russia, but he's in, and so Turkey wouldn't be able to come in today in its current state, and that's a
Right.
problem. The question is, what does NATO represent, and how do you work with a country like this that's throwing people in jail?
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for the interview. I'll pause the recording now.